if you can join me in welcoming our panel, we're going to be talking about lessons from MAAPS. Is everyone ready to hear about lessons from MAAPS from the folks on the ground? So thank you very much for being here. I'm going to just have a few questions for you, but let you take it away. Feel free to, add more, give some examples. But before we get started, if you don't mind just taking a minute to each introduce yourselves, tell us about your relationship to MAAPS, and maybe anything unique about MAAPS or your institution that you'd like to share with the audience.
Hi, I'm Christina King. I'm the Associate Director of Academic Advising for University Undergraduate Academic Advising at Purdue and the UIA Fellow. There's a lot of universities in that. And my role with MAAPS is that I supervise our MAAPS advisors, which we call the College Success Advisors. And before becoming a fellow, I was an academic advisor and had some of our treatment group students, so I worked back and forth with our College Success Advisors as well for that. At Purdue, we also utilized the supplemental coordinated advising model for background.
Hi there, I'm Aljets. I'm the UIA Fellow at Oregon State University, and I've been involved with the MAAPS project as kind of the project manager and bringing together all the different teams and personnel and pieces of the project since the project started at Oregon State in 2015. Our campus also used the supplemental advising model.
And I'll add maybe that also you're on the quarter system, which has its own challenges for proactive advising as you're trying to get there and get the data before the term is over. Allison.
Good morning. I'm Allison Calhoun-Brown. I'm the Vice President for Student Engagement and Programs at Georgia State and the advising lead for the MAAPS project at Georgia State, and have been involved in the project from the beginning.
Great, thank you. So I'd like to maybe just continue to pick up on this theme that has come up in the previous presentations about just the importance of the advisors, that they're kind of at the heart of the intervention, that they really did the heavy lifting. And the project really at the beginning, there was a lot more discussion about what they would be doing and maybe a little bit less set up for how they would do it, how they would be recruited and trained and onboarded and then supported through the 3 years of the project. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that. Christina, maybe you can get us started. So Purdue, I believe, is the only site that started with 3 advisors and actually held on to them. We know advisor turnover, as Tim mentioned, was a challenge. It can disrupt the program. It can change the caseloads. So you didn't face that, which is rather unique. Can you tell us about what you learned about what worked for Purdue and maybe the value added of having the same advisors for the entire time of the project?
Yeah, I was actually reading some of their interviews last night that the students would say their continuity of their person. So with advising, if you start in first year engineering, move to your discipline, you're getting a new advisor, and this person knew their story from the beginning, supported them in their beginning journey, so it helped for the students. In terms of retaining those advisors, we had them report up through central advising, and Sandy was very supportive of many of their professional development opportunities. They were really woven into the academic advising community. So they were a part of staff meetings with different colleges and very much a part of the academic space.
And it really showed during the site visit that they talked about central advising as if they're a team member, not separate. And then we met with some of the advisors in the community, and they also, about I think 9 of them showed up to the meeting. It was a lot given how busy they are, and they talked about the MAAPS advisors in a way that really had them they were very integrated, and it sounds like that assisted them in doing their work and feeling a sense of belonging as advisors on campus.
Yeah, we had a lot of buy-in from the academic advisors. Early on, we negotiated kind of what the relationship would be between the College Success Advisor and the academic advisor, so it gave them kind of who's doing what. And then for me, as an academic advisor at that time, it was a supplemental person to reinforce what my message to the student was. So there was a lot of communication back and forth with that too.
Thank you. Allison, so it's a little bit different at Georgia State. You had some advisor turnover over the 3 years, but it wasn't as disruptive as it was for other institutions. I know you've credited the recruiting and onboarding process before. Can you tell us more about that?
Right. So one of the things that's really important, I think, about how things worked at Georgia State was making sure that we had a good system in place, right? It's not just that we want to hire great people, although advisors are some of the best people really on any college campus ever. But it's not just about the people, it's about the system. And so we really even started with how we recruit the advisors. We changed some of what we were looking for, still looking for kind people, still looking for knowledge of academic processes, but also looking for people who have some data facility, right? And even in the interview process, asking them in some ways to demonstrate that data facility, maybe by looking at a simple chart and explaining what the takeaways would be from that chart, for instance. And then being very deliberate about the onboarding and the training. We have a very vigorous training for our academic advisors that last actually about 3 weeks, which is longer than many trainings. But again, it's about trying to develop the system and helping them understand not only do we want you to bring your personality and your own personal skills, which are extremely important in any position, but to use all the academic tools that are available and to understand the process of how we do academic advising at Georgia State, so that even when we have changes in personnel, the process in terms of how it impacts the student is not altered dramatically.
Thank you. Alex, does this resonate with you? I know you held on to 2 really motivated, wonderful advisors who are actually here. Maybe we'll hear from them at some point. So a shout out to them. How does this resonate with you in your experience at Georgia State? At Oregon State.
Yes, at Oregon State. We also, similar to Allison, we asked questions in our interview process about their experience using data and how have you used data to help students. And it was also very important. We hired originally 3 awesome advisors that were experienced, but also they were really excited to try new things. And so that seemed to be very important moving forward, because there were a lot of new things we needed to try with MAAPS, both in doing these proactive outreaches, how we were tracking it, the strategies that they were using. So that was important to our success with our awesome advisors who are here today. Shout out to you too.
So one thing that was a little bit unique about the MAAPS project is because it's part of an experiment, there were data teams. There were some folks with data expertise who were kind of on the project and in some cases, MAAPS advising teams were really able to leverage that expertise. I know at Oregon State, you had a wonderful data analyst who happened to be hired early on enough to do some work with the advisors to kind of, in terms of the data thinking and pulling from systems. Is that correct?
Yes, that was very important in our project too. And actually the close connections between the MAAPS advisors and the data analysts provided a great model for how you can have really close communication and coordination between your advising community and your data community, and really helped us to expand on that collaboration at the university overall.
Thank you. So we're going to turn back to the question about advisors and data and the advising profession maybe a little bit later. But unless you have anything to add, I want to move on to the next topic. So this is really the big question, and it's come up already, is whether and how to take something that works from one context into another. Should you do that? How do you do that? MAAPS taught a lot of lessons about bringing new processes to an existing culture and structure. And so I want to hear a little bit more about that. I know, Alex and Christina, that both of you worked really closely with the advising community. You've alluded to this, but can you say a little bit more about what were maybe some of the toughest obstacles when it came to really integrating these new processes to an existing structure? What you've learned, what you think is something you can share with the audience to take home to when they want to do something similar?
Sure. One thing Christina, you and I were talking about a lot last night was that when you have the supplemental model, when students have a major advisor and additional advisors, in this case a MAAPS advisor, there can be confusion over messaging and over who has authority over which thing. Very understandably, if students are getting 2 different messages about what classes they should take, that could be confusing. So that was a challenge we encountered early on, was about buy-in with the major advisors being a little concerned that, who's doing this, what's that relationship look like? And we handled it different ways. You want to talk about that?
And we have another supplemental advising model on campus called Purdue Promise, which has a scholarship component attached to it, but they're an intrusive advising model. But the difference for this one was that now we were adding into the academic space. And so it was who's going to have an authority for decisions about whether a student should add or drop a course that is for their major. So we had a lot of public discussions with advising to kind of decide where the divide was, and it came up with the MAAPS advisors would support the alerts and alert the student, say, you might want to ask your advisor about X. You might want to go check on this. Here are some questions to ask DFA. Here are some questions to ask advising. And so advising, with being that public negotiation, it had a lot of implied trust with that later on, that advisors trusted that they were not going to enter into their kind of territory with my department gets to decide some things with that.
Thank you. So I know with the supplemental model, this idea about degree planning was really the most challenging because they're not the advisor in a specific major who knows the ins and outs, which courses and when and what to take, and maybe some of the exceptions or hidden curriculum. And so there was negotiating a lot of that piece of how much degree planning do the MAAPS advisors do, but it's one of the key components of fidelity. Can you say a little more about how did you balance that? Did you have to compromise fidelity, or what did you do to continue to have degree planning as part of MAAPS, but without maybe alienating the community or doing something that's not beneficial to the students because the MAAPS advisors just don't have all of that information?
I think for us, we had the shared platform of sharing. So we would share back kind of what an advisor may have told a student, and so that then they could reinforce that or bring up questions to the advisor. But we did have some of that where it was tracking, but then working with the advisor behind the scenes with the student too. I think Alex had some stuff.
Yeah. Is that your shared note system?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Excellent. We had that as well. I think what was key for us was early and often communicating with the rest of the advising community and being really transparent about what this project is and the benefit to campus, and try and have that early buy-in from the rest of campus about what this project's going to bring for us and how it's going to help students specifically. But yeah, the MAAPS advisors and the major advisors communicated about specific students, and it's really important in any initiative, including this one, to be able to adapt the program or the interventions to your local context, because it's really not going to work otherwise. And this was a research study, but it's also important to us to have it be helpful for the students and for us to learn something as a campus. So we did need to not compromise, but more creatively adapt some of the strategies to what would work for our quarter system, what would work for our student population, and for our advising culture.
Okay, thank you. So speaking of adapting to a different culture, Allison, so you didn't have to adapt MAAPS or get campus buy-in necessarily because it was an enhancement of what you were already doing, but I know that you're bringing MAAPS-like advisement to Perimeter College, which is a 2-year college, which actually just when MAAPS launched is when it was consolidated with Georgia State. So what, can you tell us a little bit about that and maybe what lessons you're taking from MAAPS and bringing to that process?
Right, so it's been very exciting. Not only has Georgia State been doing MAAPS, but in 2016 we were consolidated with the largest 2-year institution in the state of Georgia, a school, a college called Georgia Perimeter College. It had about 20,000 students, and those 20,000 students became Georgia State students. And you can imagine the adaptations that are involved with rolling out a new advisement model to an entirely different college that had become Perimeter College of Georgia State University. And I think the one thing that we really take from some of that experience and take from our MAAPS experience as well is the importance of preparing the culture for a process change, right? You cannot just overlay a new technology, just open it up out of the box and expect that it's going to work. Similarly, it's very difficult just to roll out a new process and say, here, we have a new process, use it, right? It doesn't work like that. And it didn't work like that at Perimeter College because they had, Perimeter College has 5 different campuses, suburban campuses, and an online presence. There were distinct cultures that went with each campus. And so we had to start doing the hard work of working with the faculty and working with the deans and building degree pathways and having conversations about what advisement was going to look like and, moving away, what is the role of a faculty advisor and how is that going to work? And literally every single conversation from the beginning. And even though we had some academic successes with our advisement model on the Atlanta campus, they didn't automatically say, we love that. We'll have that too. It didn't work like that. We had to really try to build the culture, and the way you build the culture is through communication, through having a champion, through having conversations about buy-in, by talking about appropriate adaptations for the context so that can be successful. And we have rolled out a predictive analytics model at Perimeter College that's showing tremendous results. The graduation rate at Perimeter College is up by about 3 times just within these 3 years, so up to about 18% from 6%. Long way to go, but good progress.
Great. Good. Quick question, Allison, just to follow up. Sorry, Alex. Intensive degree planning using that tool that shows the 4 years or how long, that was a little bit new to Georgia State that MAAPS added, not just enhanced. Can you say a little bit about that? Is that something that you think would work at Perimeter with a kind of 2-year process?
Yes, we've already started to integrate some elements of more comprehensive degree planning because we did the predictive analytics, but we really want to lay out for the students, how can you complete this a 2-year degree? And particularly because you're only doing 2 years and not the 4 years, there's a lot more capacity to do that. So we're working on rolling out some MAAPS style advisement in the 2-year space.
Thank you. So Alex and then Christina, do you have any advice for Allison or Georgia State as folks who had to really adapt something new to a different culture? Any advice for her, recommendations from MAAPS?
Mine, it sounds like you're already doing, of listening to the advisors for what the culture is before just laying it on top. So that sounds like what you're already doing.
Excellent. One thing we learned that may be helpful is that you can provide lots of data access, but that you also have to translate what that looks like and how to use that data and when and how and where in the advising context. And so we spent a lot of time, the MAAPS advisors were kind of trailblazers in leading trainings and making templates and calendars and trying to make it as streamlined as possible so that advisors have access to the data and the new tools, but know actually how to use it and integrate it into their practice. So it sounds like maybe you're doing some of that as well.
Thank you. Thank you all. So I'm going to turn a little bit, speaking of the data and the systems, I'd like to talk a little bit more about that. So MAAPS was meant to be a technology-enhanced, data-informed intervention. And the data part, as we mentioned before, sometimes the platforms were not there, sometimes the systems were not really friendly. I'd love to hear a little bit more from each of you about what that meant. I know at Georgia State, you've been perfecting these systems since 2012, at the very least, predictive analytics, onboarding advisors on daily getting those alerts, how to pull that information, how to use it. How much did that background, the fact that it was already rolled out and what you have, how much of that do you think contribute to the success of MAAPS at Georgia State, Allison?
I do think that it's helpful. MAAPS came out of the Georgia State context, right? And it fit Georgia State, and we had some momentum around some momentum around that approach, and I think that is very important. What I take away from the entire MAAPS experience, and some of it shows up in the data and some of it doesn't show up in the data yet, is that we can really change how we do academic advising using technology to enhance the information that we use to support students. Really, that's what, to me, it's a really simple concept. That's what it's all about. It has made academic advisement different. It has created margin to do some things that it used to take the advisors a really long time to prepare, or they just kind of had their gut instincts. They didn't have the data that actually backed it up. Now they actually have the data that backs up some dynamics that they thought were, going on, or they can be disavowed of some misimpressions as well. So it doesn't, it doesn't, sometimes advisors are afraid, that this will replace us, or, no, nothing could be farther from the truth. Using technology, and even Georgia State's now relatively long history using technology, has improved the way that we support students. It's improved the way that we support advisors and provided them with a lot more detailed information that they can share with their students. All of us had academic advisement. Georgia State's been doing every institution's been doing academic advisement for a very long time. But, with these new tools, we can do it better, we can do it more efficiently, we can do it more effectively. and use the technology to enhance some really old processes.
Thank you. So I know at Purdue and Oregon State, it was a little bit different, and you had different experiences from Georgia State, but also different experiences from each other in terms of what was already available and how you adapted that or what you learned from it. Can you, maybe Alex, tell us a little bit about your experience with data infrastructure for the project?
Yes, so we primarily, for our kind of data system, use a homegrown data environment that has a whole bunch of data, and advisors have access to a whole bunch of it. Maybe too much sometimes, and that's the challenge, is trying to figure out what data to use for what when. And so the MAAPS advisors were able to partner with our institutional analytics and reporting group to develop new reports and to revise existing reports that would be tailored to proactive advising. And so they were kind of on the forefront of testing and developing those things around the needs for proactive advising. And then they've used them in MAAPS and have since kind of rolled those things out to the rest of the advising community.
Thank you. Christina?
At Purdue, we have a Tableau dashboard that the advisors use that showed what classes were added or dropped to a student so they could proactively reach out and say, like, that one, was there a reason? You kind of need it. And that's a newer thing for campus. So looking at, is that doable for the rest of campus? What does that mean for proactive advising, that the advisors have time to do the proactive piece on top of their full load already as the change occurs? But then for us, what was novel and helpful is the shared note system. So that was new as a part of MAAPS across campus, and that was very helpful in sharing notes with the Career Center or wherever, that the student didn't have to retell their story. That it was a quicker, informed conversation once they went to the next office. So that was one thing that was helpful.
Thank you. And that dashboard you mentioned, am I correct that that was developed specifically for MAAPS?
Yes.
So
and
even,
only used by MAAPS.
And only used by MAAPS. So for just a quick note that from the implementation study, what we learned at Purdue was that even though there were already systems in place and they worked well, they didn't quite give advisors what they needed for MAAPS. And so they were really able to leverage their talented data analysts who created a dashboard for their MAAPS students specifically, and they could cut it in different ways and very quickly, visually be able to see who might be struggling, who to reach out to at a particular time, and that was very helpful.
Very helpful. As an advisor, I sign a paper, you make it to the registrar by 5 or you don't. And then I might be able to look at it tomorrow, but this gave them, yes, they made it. They were able to add drop. They got the instructor's signature and moved on.
Thank you. So do you, maybe a wish, if you thought, MAAPS ended a little bit prematurely, as Bridget said, but if there was something that you wished could continue at your institution that you learned from MAAPS or that was developed from MAAPS, what would that be? Just thinking about, not just in the next year, but moving forward.
Well, I think that we got much better about strategy, right? And really integrating technology and data and advisement, really putting the pieces together to be much more strategic in our outreach. As Tim mentioned in his presentation, historically at Georgia State, the students who came in were the very good ones and the ones who were struggling. Now we can really move the needle with those students who are in the middle, for whom timely intervention matters the most.
I would say my wish is that every student at Purdue feels like they have a person. So the CSAs were really these students' people that they went to for emotional support, for academic navigation of the resources, but why they choose them versus their primary advisor, or where they felt that fit for, like, this is my person who they grabbed onto, but that all students would have that support network.
Thank you.
Excellent. I'm going to get 3 wishes because I'm going to take that one and that one. Those are fantastic. I'd agree with both of you. But I think the one really interesting thing to me from MAAPS that we learned was around the impact of finances in students' ability to complete. And that was the most common topic that students were talking to their MAAPS advisors about. And so one wish I'd have going forward, because one thing that was really helpful, that the MAAPS advisors had the time to be able to dig into those financial issues and weren't afraid of talking about finances. It can be kind of a tricky subject. And they had the capacity to have the time for those conversations and time to learn more about our financial systems at the university and in higher ed broadly. that they could help students navigate some of those things and make really close connections with like our Office of Financial Aid to resolve issues. And those types of things just aren't possible with the larger caseloads that many of our academic advisors have. And so if I had one wish going forward is that we'd kind of figure out some strategies to more closely tie academic and financial advising and integrate interventions to address financial challenges more thoroughly throughout the university.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. And if I may add a piece, this really resonates with what we found in the implementation study. A lot of the advisors would say, especially in that first year, that, yeah, degree planning sounds great, but what we did when we spent an hour with the student is talk about their finances. How are they even going to stay in school? How are they going to manage their jobs and their course load? If they need to take summer, how do they stay on campus? How do they pay for that? Summer classes. And so there was a lot of that conversation. And what the MAAPS advisors did, again, that this wasn't added to their load, was build those relationships with the different offices on campus. But a lot of it was personality. I know, Allison, you keep saying you can't just rely on personality. Some people, right, they were extroverted, they went the extra mile, they found someone really friendly in registrar and financial aid, made those connections, but that a lot of them, their wish list was that it shouldn't be that way. There should be something more systematic, more built in at the institutional level to get all of this information, be able to support students so that the advisors can then continue to do the rest of the work, but also integrate that in the conversation. So as you plan for the degree, to understand that if you take fewer extra credits, what that's going to mean, not just for your progress, but for your financial health and well-being, and how to troubleshoot that, who to speak with, if that's something that's coming down the road, to plan ahead for it. So that really resonates with other people's wish lists in the MAAPS interviews. So I think we are ready to adjourn the panel, but I want to make sure, is there anything that you want to add? Any final comments or notes to the audience or reflections? No pressure. Yeah, sure, we can take questions from the audience. Do you have any questions for the panelists? Do we have a mic going around, or should I send this to the back?
We have extras.
Hello again, Tanya Garcia from the Georgetown Center. So I think one of the best things I'm excited about in the work that you're doing is really learning more about the journeys of first-generation students. And we're really just craving stories on, what happens to them and how we can better serve them. And so my question for you is, you mentioned, financial challenges. What are some of the new or other navigational challenges that you've learned about that can help us better understand this population? Yes, but expand if you'd like.
Yeah, well, certainly the financial challenges continue to be, I think, paramount. But also a lot of work, we're trying to focus at Georgia State a lot on making real substantive connections between college and career for these students. Many times students come in, they don't have a really good understanding of the differences between majors or where those majors can lead, right? And the understanding that they have may not even be accurate, and there are a lot more options. And so really from the very first year and through academic advisement and many of the tools that we have at Georgia State, we're really trying systematically to give students exposure. We've changed how we bring them in. We've moved to a meta-major-based learning community model that allows students to have broad exposure within those meta majors so that when they make a choice, that it will be a substantive choice. And we've actually seen a decrease of more than 30% in major switches after the year, in part because of this more systematic approach, so that when they do select a major, that it's a good major for them, one where they can progress and be successful. And as importantly, and maybe even more importantly, realize the career aspirations that they have through that major.
I really appreciate your question, because one of my favorite things from the MAAPS project has been that it allowed us as a university to really get a close view and kind of take a microscope to the first generation student experience at our university and notice some things that were confusing to students. One that came up a lot in the first year was just our communication to students as an institution, that we were sending a lot of emails and that a lot of them had jargon, and that students were quite confused by certain steps and processes. So an interesting story from the first year was that the MAAPS advisors noticed that several students were experiencing the same financial aid issue that was causing their financial aid not to be dispersed. And so if you don't have money to pay, your financial aid doesn't come through, you can't pay your tuition, you can't buy textbooks, you're not getting a refund. There's a lot of challenges there. And so they noticed this, and they noticed this trend because their whole population were first generation and or low income students. If the MAAPS program hadn't been there, those students would have been kind of spread throughout the university, and we might not have noticed this particular trend, that it turned out to be a critical email that several students had missed or misinterpreted, and they didn't take a certain step to go sign something. It was as simple as that. And so the MAAPS advisors were able to address that, and we worked with the Office of Financial Aid, and they adjusted that communication for future years. And so through looking valuing the expertise of our advisors and having like a great feedback loop of, hey, tell us what are students experiencing, we're able to learn a lot and I think improve as a university on how we serve those students.
Any other questions? I think we have a few more minutes if you'd like to find out more. There's one over here.
It's not so much a question, but it's more an observation. So I'm from Purdue, and one of the things is that when we look at this, the challenge, if you would, if you go back, we couch it in the nature that why are we failing, right? I mean, why are so many students not being successful? And it's not that the advisors in the past didn't care deeply about the students and work. It's the universities and the grand sense are set up, just like the example Alex put forth. There's just lots of little things that elude us because our days are so full and our work is so much, and advising loads and I think you said, Allison, 800 students per, there's no way that you can dive in and have that kind of a sense. So I think what the MAAPS project has done for each, and like Tim said, we have 11 basically case studies because we're comparing it against work as normal, if you would. But I think in our case, on our campus, one of the things that it's really helped us to discover is what are the marginal changes that you can make. And I think the other thing is we always look for a silver bullet. We want to jump the graduation rate by 20%. It's probably not going to happen. You're going to identify things for very small sets of students, 20 at a time, 30 at a time, but it's the cumulative effect of finding these things that leads to the change, if you would. But I think where I was really trying to go, I think the important things is when we start thinking that people are doing something wrong, it's really hard for the people that write advisors, we got to fix your work. And so we need to be really careful in the communication to people because you put them on the defensive right out of the start, right? We're going to have another person come in and so Christina and Sandy Monroe, they did a marvelous job of saying, no, this is it's like a care network, if you would, rather than you did something wrong. But I think going forward, one of the bigger challenges is trying to get this notion that it's not an individual, it's actually the entire university, and getting the recognition of that. But I don't think any of us in any of our universities, we're large, complicated places with more complexity than we can anticipate. And getting people to recognize it's not them, but it's us, is probably the key.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our panel for your insights.